Welcome, everybody, today to the Darren Newman Dialogues. And I have a great friend with me, Joe Palmer. It's great to see you today. Um, I I always love to hear our discussions. I wish I wish sometimes that they would have put a recording on us when we've talked in most recently a pizza shop in Lexington, Kentucky.
Yeah.
So it's just such and also on the telephone when we get thinking about these great ideas and as we cover wonder, wisdom, and the wild with the whole all of the dialogues. um there's a sense of wonder always comes up in me in the midst of our conversations because it's always interesting and I always gain wisdom. Maybe we could call that a wild wisdom, but it puts me very much in touch with everything. So it's great to see you today. So enough about this introduction. Uh, and I I could usually turn this over to you, but there's a question that's burning in my mind, and I want to share with those who are listening about this interesting story that you told me one time, and you can fill in, what you're doing right now, as far as your contributions and your calling. That's fine, but I want to jump to that story soon enough that we can gain from history and that perspective something that is really rich. But I first want to hear this story, and 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 it takes place during the American Revolution.
Correct.
And I almost just want to turn it over to you and just sit back and let you teach me something on this. So Joe, please go ahead with that story you shared with me. But
Yeah. It's I remember sitting in Bobby's class, um, hearing this story for the first time, and
mhm.
uh,
And Bob Leith, incidentally, was he was my professor of history and also your professor of history. And I
correct,
just want to introduce him. He's a professor of history that taught at Ohio University.
one of the greats. So in the during the revolution, especially after 1778, late in that year, after the Battle of Saratoga, and the major continental victory at that time,
Hmm.
the British really turned towards a Southern strategy where they felt that in the Southern colonies, they had a lot of Tory loyalists in the hills and the rural areas, that were, loyal to the crown, mainly for economic reasons. Now,
Mm.
a lot of leaders in Britain sorely overestimated the number of Tory loyalists that would be coming out of those hills and rural areas to help them. George Washington appointed Nathaniel Greene
Hmm.
to oversee the continental forces there in the South. And Nathaniel Greene almost immediately split command of his troops into two, and uh, one of the men that he put in charge of his forces was Daniel Morgan.
Hmm. If I can
And
interject a question as a student, as I'm listening
yeah,
to this, um, tell me and tell all of us why it was that explore that just a little bit to give me the context why it was that the southern part of the colony or the southern colonies were so aligned with Britain during the American Revolution. Why was that?
well, economics is really the idea here. You had so many crops that were being grown in the South that, they just, mercantilism, they couldn't produce these things in
Yeah,
Britain, rice and tobacco
right.
and not so much cotton just yet, but it would ultimately become,
Hmm.
king of that later on. Um, but yeah, the institution of slavery in the South, you have the pricing for these goods, the wholesale prices for the mercantilist value, that triangular trade, that it was very profitable for Britain.
Mhm.
And it was also profitable for the plantation owners there in the South.
So
It's kind of,
it's almost like an economic factor is um, enabling them to lean either way on that political divide during that time of history of the United States, whether for Tory or for loyalist or for revolutionary, call it. So it's kind of economics is having a part in that. Is that
absolutely.
correct?
Oh,
Okay,
absolutely. And the grand irony is that later on, and I don't want to diverge, too much,
sure,
but of
sure.
course later on, the fact that Britain ends slavery in its colonial holdings shortly after the American Revolution will be a big factor in Lincoln's decision to issue the Emancipation Proclamation when he did, as a way to deter further British involvement um, with the Confederate States. But
Yeah,
it's a whole different topic. But it's
sure,
kind of an
sure. And I
interesting
didn't mean
through
to
line.
get us
No,
off track, but
no, that's my fault. I can't help myself
yeah,
sometimes.
you're all right. You're all right.
Um,
I want to encourage everyone to keep listening with this, that this isn't just a history lesson.
no, not at all. Yeah.
There's some deep philosophical wise truths that are going to be coming in, and I want to encourage everybody as we're listening to this story. And I appreciate that digression. But continue on with what you were saying with the leadership
Yeah.
against the British, and go on with that, and I'll try to back off of all these questions and
No,
just
that's
come
fine.
roaring in because
No, it's great.
this to me just becomes so alive. Yeah.
It's so Daniel Moore, ultimately what had happened was that in these southern colonies, the southern planters were not treated very well by
Okay.
a lot of the British
Okay.
officers and the British military and people affiliated with the crown. And they had overestimated the number of people that would be out. So what this leads to is some very intense fighting in the South.
Mm.
Most of the Southern colonies are split about 50-50,
Mhm.
and which was a very different different
Mhm.
numbers wise than it was in the North. And Nathaniel Greene had just, obviously geographically, there's just so much more ground to cover and so many different terrains. So Nathaniel Greene splits his force, and namely the story at hand here comes with Daniel Morgan at the Battle of the Cowpens. And, this battle, Daniel Morgan has on paper, about 100 less men than the British General Tarleton that he was set to face. But that's a it's kind of on paper it may seem not much of a difference, but the reality is that most of the men that Morgan was dealing with were militia volunteers who
Mhm.
in those southern colonies had a history of just running away when the battle got
Mm.
difficult. Or when things started looking bad. And
They
this was,
just gave up. In other words, they
they would,
just.
yeah, they would just run. And it's hard to blame. Some of these guys are hardly guys. They're 15-year-old boys. Some of them,
Mm.
so it's just one of those realities of war. But this is a situation where Daniel Morgan understood that he had to hold ground.
Mhm.
He had to remain effective. And as is so often the case when you're studying battles, the strategic value of certain points can become really, dense.
Mhm.
But it's to say that this portion of South Carolina, this area where the Battle of Cowpens took place, was very important for supply lines. There were two rivers there. And
And what state is this, Joe?
this is in South Carolina.
Okay, South Carolina. All right. I didn't catch that. Okay, so it's
Um,
Cowpens, South Carolina. All right.
so in January of 1781, this battle had been these battles in the South had been raging for 3 years, and Morgan, he spent the night before he was finally to meet Tarleton in this decisive battle over these critical supply lines, and he spent the night going around personally to these militiamen and encouraging them and
Hmm.
delivering speeches to them and rallying
Really?
them for the battle to come.
So in other
And
words, it's sort of I wouldn't say one-on-one conversations, but he's actually going around to
yes,
to all of to all of the people as much as he can to
yeah,
encourage them to talk with them personally.
yeah, to fight with them, to
Mm,
inspire them, and to and to really, he's dealing with these guys that had this history of kind of running away when things get
hmm.
rough, and uh, quietly though he was still very pessimistic, and he reported to Nathaniel Greene that he felt that the force was still inadequate. So what he did
Mm.
um, was that because he felt like it was impossible to keep them together, to make sure that they stayed engaged, he positioned his men between the Pacolet and Broad Rivers. And as Bob Leaf so eloquently put it, said, you can either fight or swim.
Yeah, I want to hold on to this moment because this is where it gets interesting for a lot of people, even when I've shared this story outside of our conversation. And I know we've played it long. It's played over and over in my head. So let me make sure that I know where we're at, that he decides to move, to put them on the move, to hold them together. So talk about that, just if you would take a couple moments and bring us up to that point that they're at the that juncture that you're putting them at between these rivers.
So the idea is that he knows, and he actually personally said that he didn't expect to even have 2/3 of this militia force when the battle started getting as heated as they knew it would get. These two
So they would
rivers,
run.
that they would run, that they would not stand and fight
So
as per
he
their
thought that
history.
2/3 would run, or he
He
would
felt
only
that
have.
he felt that not even 2/3 of them would stay. So he felt
Hmm.
that at least a third of those militia, along
Okay.
with the regulars that he had, but that militia force, which would be about half of the men he had, he didn't feel like even 2/3 of them would stay. And when you're dealing with, a matter of hundreds, I mean, it's critical to have every man.
Hmm.
And so the way that these rivers, if there was a map, it would be easier to point it out. But these rivers run somewhat parallel to one another, and one kind of comes around in a bend. And as Tarleton was coming through, they were kind of in a race to the Broad River, and uh,
Hmm.
and Morgan understood that there was, if these men had an option to run, that they almost certainly would. His
Yeah,
own
this
men.
that is interesting. That
And
if they had had the option, they're going to take the easy road out. So it's not like a noble cause. He though he as much as he tried to inspire that, there's still that propensity. They're really they can be very cowardly. I mean, they can easily turn to that. We can easily turn and run, game over, forget about it. I'm not going to fight anymore. You can have it. um,
right.
just like it's like almost like a loser mentality. We're not going to win anyway. Or well, I don't know about that, but that's interesting about that human frailty that he's trying to he's trying to hold on to as this person that is leading them and trying to bring them into a way of understanding what's at stake. He knows their propensity to take the easy way out, which is something that I think humanity constantly deals with. That we've I mean, it's much easier to complain and run or run and complain or whatever than it is to be in the midst of the fighting. It's like it goes back to Teddy Roosevelt's men in the arena. It's easy to be along that side, complaining or talking about the people who are in there fighting when you have never. I think he even say cowardly, timid souls who never understood the worth of that. I think he calls them cowardly timid. And it's interesting that they'll take that way. They'll run. They will literally leave you. Interesting. Fascinating. So he's trying to hold this together. And I'm sorry that I keep interrupting, but
Oh,
I
no,
have
it's
to.
great.
I love these questions and I love thinking about this. So he puts them in between these rivers and continue on with the story of what's going on here, because there's this
So
wonderful point here.
so basically, and it's important to note that there had been a great deal of rainfall right
Oh, here
around
we
this
go.
time. These
This is
rivers were
interesting.
swollen. Um, it took some doing navigating through the rivers in this area. Just getting their forces in place. But basically, once the supply lines were secured, their only, your only option was you were either going to fight and win that battle, or you were going to have to try to swim across a wide, swollen, rushing, flooded river
So, so
on
like
your
you had
own.
told me before, he moved them across the river with the intention, and that's the point, with that intention to get them to understand that you will either fight or you will run, but you will drown in the river. So
Yeah,
they're either, so that your opponent has pushed you to that point, and he's put them face to face with the British, correct?
correct.
That's really fascinating. So, so really, he has this move. He's making this decision to put his the people that he is in charge over in this awkward position. I call it awkward, but it's the position to draw out the best in them.
Exactly. Exactly.
That's fascinating. So it's a psychological game of everything that is at stake. So if you would carry on with that story, does he win that battle?
Yeah. He some of it was a little bit of luck. A lot of it was Daniel Morgan's brilliance as a battlefield commander.
Mm-hmm.
But the way that he had positioned his troops allowed him to actually pull off a double envelopment, a la Hannibal. Um, uh, and Lord Tarleton surrendered almost
That's
immediately
fascinating.
once he had been surrounded. It was decisive, and it was incredibly important for the momentum,
Mm-hmm.
taking on through the way that it did in the rest of 1781 and the early 17, leading to Yorktown, essentially.
Mm.
So, yeah, it
So
was
we
can't be
have this
overstated.
thing. I interrupted you there. Go on.
Oh yeah, it just can't be overstated how important and significant a victory that was. And um, you know, you have this notion. I remember I mean, it gave me chills because
Mm.
I look at the revolution. You have these politically inspiring things that people are doing, but then you
Mm-hmm.
also, as correlating with these heroic acts of military service and bravery, and they're just happening all at the same time. And
Yeah,
it's remarkable, and it's like these guys. I think that what Daniel Morgan was trying to say to them is that if you know something is the most important thing, if you already know that,
Oh, this is good. Come on.
eliminate any chance that you will give anything less than your best.
Yeah,
Everything that you've got, that you eliminate the chance that you will give anything less than all of yourself to it. If it's the most important thing, then it is the most important thing. And that's it.
I gotta hold on to this, as I always do tell students. I'm going to give you some gold. So I always repeat the gold. So you're giving me gold, you're giving all of us gold, and I want you to repeat that right there, because there is something of a deep, beautiful truth of life here that I want to make sure that we're getting a hold of. So repeat that again, Joe. Give us that gold again, because I'm wanting to feast my mind upon it.
It's if you know that the thing that you are going to do is the most important thing,
Yes.
then eliminate all possibility that you will give anything less than 100% of yourself to it.
If that is the most important thing to you, in other words, remove anything that it's just going to hinder your attention, that's going to come in on the scene, take away that vigor, that how can I how can I call it, that attention, that attentiveness. You're removing all away, and that's leading you to that point where then and only then can you have the victory that you're needing.